progressive, sustainable health system that promotes Jitni Walihoda, which is our ways. Our mission is that we want to provide the highest quality holistic health care to ensure the wellness for our Oneida community. And then our values are responsive leadership, communication, trust is the foundation, safety, culturally sensitive in our care, in our interactions, and then respect. We've incorporated the 5 principles of nation building. Recently we started going through some leadership training with a consultant, and that's one of the things that we're pushing with our decisions going forward. So transformational leadership, we want to have strong governing systems, we want to be culturally relevant, we want to look at strategy and strategic outlook, and then sovereignty. So it's really nice to have these collaborations with the University of Wisconsin-Madison and some other groups, so I'm pleased to have our guests here tonight. And then our nation building themes. So our topic tonight, right, use relevant data for decision making, but we're going to be talking about people's personal data, integrate Oneida values into healthcare, and strengthen our healthcare collaboration. Again, this is part of the interactions and the collaborations with the UW system. And then creating a sustainable health system and advance community engagement. So that's why we have these meetings, to invite the community, provide like in-person ability, stream ability, and then also for people that can't attend, be able to watch it later and submit questions. So we do have a survey that we would like you to take after this. So I'd like to introduce Dr. McClester Davis.
Thank you, Dr. White. All right, thank you, Dr. White, and thank you to Comprehensive Health for having this collaboration where we get to talk about a few different things. So we'll talk about treaties and trust responsibilities of the United States regarding Oneida. We'll talk about data that happens in healthcare. And can you hear me okay online? Okay. We'll be able to have a discussion about what that looks like. So can everybody hear me now? All right. So I just wanted to go over some background about treaties and trust responsibilities as it relates to Oneida. So treaties are legally binding agreements between sovereign nations, and the United States enters into treaties with tribal nations historically, and they have stopped entering into treaties with tribal nations. But you can think about treaties as something like the United States Constitution or Bill of Rights. They're a little bit different in that treaties recognize the rights that were already there. So each tribal nation had rights existing here in what we call the United States today, and treaties recognize what those rights are. A tribal government, like Oneida's government, has a relationship with the United States federal government, as well as relationships with the state of Wisconsin and other state governments and other local governments based on treaties and trust responsibilities. Now, like I said before, not all tribes actually have treaties because the U.S. stopped entering into treaties with tribal nations. But that goes back to a greater concept that is now the Federal Indian Trust Responsibility. This is a responsibility of the United States which is legally enforceable, and it's a fiduciary obligation of the United States federal government to support the self-determination of federally recognized tribes. So the relationship between the U.S. federal government and tribal nations is based on things such as treaties, but also a general trust responsibility. Self-determination is really the right of tribes to control their own affairs, make their own decisions about their tribe, and direct the governance, education, and resources of their tribe. So it's the U.S. federal responsibility to help support self-determination in terms of governance, in terms of decisions about education, our resources, things like that. Any questions so far? Feel free to raise your hand and ask any questions or any comments as we go through. So some treaties that have occurred with Oneida. So there are different treaties between the British, New York State, and the U.S. that have happened with the Oneida tribe. So these ones on this page are all with the British. So in 1722, there was the Great Treaty with the Five Nations, or also known as the Treaty of Albany. In 1744, there was the Treaty of Lancaster with the Six Nations. In 1752, there was the Treaty of Logstown with Six Nations. In 1754, there was the Albany Congress or Albany Plan of Union with Six Nations. In 1760, there was the Treaty with the Six Nations, and in 1768, there was the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, or the grant from the Six Nations to the King and agreement of the boundary line with Six Nations, Shawnee, Delaware, and Mingos of Ohio tribes. So none of these treaties generally stand up today, but they do lay the groundwork for later treaties with Oneida. And treaties in general were exchanges of land and guarantees of peace that were provided between the Oneida and the British government in this case for these treaties listed on this page. And later on we have treaties with the United States after it succeeds in the Revolutionary War. So these treaties and the treaties afterwards are either with the US or with New York State. So in 1784, there was the treaty with Six Nations. The Six Nations generally agreed to release hostages of the United States and confirm peace with the US in exchange for being provided land that already existed under Oneida rule and other goods provided by the US government as well. In 1785, there was the Treaty of Fort Hermaker, which similarly had an exchange of land and reaffirmed land that already existed under Oneida control. The same thing happened in 1788 with Schuyler, Fort Schuyler. And in 1789, there was the Treaty with the Six Nations where the land of Oneida was actually relinquished westward of a certain boundary line. Peace was agreed again between Six Nations and the US federal government. And both the Six Nations and the US agreed that if they had any criminals, that they would be punished according to the justice under which the crime happened. So if you were Oneida, you would face Six Nations law about crimes that were to happen, and if you were a US citizen, you would face US law about crimes that were to happen. This provided the Oneida in turn with the land that had already been, as you can see, described to be under Oneida control. And that agreement that if a criminal was from one community, they would be punished according to that community's laws. In 1794, there was the treaty with the Oneidas, etc., is how the official document is titled, and that includes the Stockbridge and Tuscarora tribes. And this was related to the support that Oneida gave to the US during the Revolutionary War. And what Oneida received was $5,000 in 1794 and the provision of a mill and milliners and a church to Oneida by the US. So these were treaties that the US entered into, officially negotiated by agents of the president and ratified by 2/3 of the Senate. And so from 1778, so here we have our first one with Oneida as part of Six Nations in 1784. The federal government of the United States entered into over 370 treaties with various tribal nations, including Oneida, up until 1871. So we have some additional treaties to go through. So also in 1794, there was another treaty made with Six Nations. This reaffirmed peace between the US and the Six Nations tribes, and it provided the US with specific land claims so that they could build infrastructure and also a roadway system across tribal lands. This also reaffirmed existing land under Six Nations control, provided $10,000 in goods, and an annual $4,500 provided to under the auspice of other utensils suited to their circumstances and in compensating useful artificers who shall reside with or near them and be employed for their benefit. So basically providing $4,500 from the US to Six Nations annually to support the infrastructure, the economic growth, and other needed instruments to advance Six Nations priorities. In 1798, there was the Treaty with Oneida, and this defined a specific village that existed in Oneida being given to the United States and under their control now. And there was a $300 payment, as well as a $200 payment, and then $700 annually in exchange for that specific land. In 1802, there was the treaty with the Oneida, and again, there was a specific land settlement that was given to the United States, and similar payouts of $300, $600, and then $300 annually, and a reaffirming of the land under Oneida control in this treaty. In the 1800s, there was actually various treaties between Oneida and New York State. These are not considered to be recognized by the US government now because New York State did not have its own government relationship as an independent nation with Oneida. And so even though Oneida gave up a lot of land in these treaties with New York State, the returns on those treaties from New York State are not seen as legal according to the US federal government at this point in time. In 1822, between the US federal government and Oneida, there was the treaty with the Stockbridge, Munsee, Oneida, Menominee, Mohawk, Tuscarora. This did not end up being ratified by the US. So these would have to be ratified by 2/3 of the US Senate after everyone had signed on to them to actualize them into legal treaties between the sovereign nations. So it wasn't ratified, but it's worth noting that the Menominee agreed to give up land to secure specific goods given to them. And because that wasn't ratified in 1822, there were treaties in 1831 and 1832 between the United States and Menominee where they gave up land, and this allowed Oneida to receive, in 1831, 500,000 acres of land, as well as supplies of timbers and infrastructure to create highways. And in 1832, there was a change in the amount of acreage and the location of that acreage provided to Oneida. In the 1836 treaty with the New York Indians in Wisconsin, which was not ratified by the United States, there was land that Oneida gave up and offered peace in exchange for a bunch of money, including $250,000 for removal to a new homeland, $50,000 of which went to a school and assistance of the aged, infirm, and orphans, with investments from specific money set aside for them in stocks, which interest provided to the Oneida annually, outlining specific land, and as well as $36,800 to the Oneida people, with the remaining for those other costs that I mentioned before. So this did not end up being ratified by the United States, and so none of those benefits were seen. But there were later treaties that explained some of the land movement as well. So instead of moving to further away into where a lot of people ended up in the current state of Oklahoma, they would stay in Wisconsin. And in 1838, there was the treaty with the New York Indians, which Oneida gave up more land, offered more peace, and received $400,000, quote, from time to time. So it didn't promise an annual basis from the United States, but provided assistance in education and other aid, as outlined in this treaty, which was ratified. And then in 1838, there was also the treaty with Oneida. So land was given up and allotment began. So 100 acres were provided to each individual in the tribe at that time, as well as a lump sum of $33,500 from the U.S. to Oneida in total. And this is where our current land basis sits in the reservation that we know today. In 1863, there was also the treaty with the New York Indians in Kansas, which was not ratified. So those who have relatives that went to Kansas and Oklahoma area, they were giving up land, and one of the reasons that we or our ancestors didn't go to Kansas or Oklahoma was because a lot of people there were being killed by other groups. And so in this treaty, it outlined specific payments that the U.S. was giving for the death of, deaths caused by U.S. citizens. It defined that the land was exempt from taxation in the Kansas-Oklahoma area, reaffirmed what those land borders looked like, and gave a payment of $70 per individual. This, again, was not ratified by the U.S., so those benefits were not seen. And in 1909, there was the agreement with the Oneida of Wisconsin. This was not ratified by the Senate. Again, they stopped ratifying treaties with tribes in 1871. However, this agreement is considered valid in U.S. court. And this talks about the 1794 annual payment of $4,500 to Oneida, which 1,000 of it went directly to Oneida and not to the other 6 nations. And they changed this to the U.S. paying a cash payment in full and reallocating the land according to the population. So any questions about the treaties? Yes?
The question I have is 1863 treaty with New York Indians of Kansas. Do you know, or is that available, the number of persons who met there and then the number of deaths?
The question is about the 1863 treaty with the New York Indians in Kansas and what the population looked like of Oneidas living in that region and listed at that time. So you can find this treaty document fully scanned online. So that is available. I believe there are some books by historians about what that movement looked like. I don't know if I've seen an exact number of Oneida people that went there and or the exact number of deaths. So I think in the treaty it does list the total payment of $70 per individual for X number of individuals, but I would have to go back and look at it. So my contact information is at the beginning of the slides. So if you email me about that, I can look that up for sure. Yeah, other questions?
How about, I'm not very good at knowing like what $1 equaled in 1822. I guess that's what's like hard for me, because I'm thinking like current money.
Yeah, what does that look like?
Some kind of like anything that helps kind of know, like, is that significant, not significant? I guess that's.
Yeah, so I did look up in the 1836 treaty with the New York Indians of Wisconsin. There was one calculator that showed that the $36,800 that Oneida was supposed to receive, what that looked like today would be $352,000 annually. So it's really hard to say, right, what that looked like, but that's one guess estimate of what that money would look like today. Other questions? So all of these treaties boil down to exchanges of land and peace in advancement for specific goods, services, land being provided, right? And all of these things are supported in the trust responsibility of the United States for the tribes to self-govern themselves. So this is a quote by President Nixon. The total quote is, "The special relationship between Indians and the federal government is the result of solemn obligations that have been entered into by the United States government. Down through the years, through written treaties and formal and informal agreements, our government has made specific commitments to the Indian people. For their part, the Indians have often surrendered claims to vast tracts of land and have accepted life on government reservations. In exchange, the government has agreed to provide community services such as health, education, and public safety, services that would presumably allow Indian communities to enjoy a standard of living comparable to that of other Americans. This goal, of course, has never been achieved, but the special relationship between the Indian tribes and the federal government that arises from these agreements continues to carry immense moral and legal force. To terminate this relationship would be no more appropriate than to terminate the citizenship rights of any other American. And if you scan the QR code on this slide, you can see more quotes from US presidents, senators, congresspeople throughout time reaffirming the treaties that the US has entered into between tribes and the overall trust responsibility of the United States to enable tribes to self-govern. So the authority to self-govern, another word for it is, sovereignty. It's a legal word for the ordinary concept of tribes creating their own governments, governing themselves. And hundreds of treaties, along with Supreme Court rulings, presidential orders, and Congress have repeatedly affirmed that tribal nations retain their inherent powers of self-government. These treaties, executive orders, and laws have been created a fundamental contract between tribal nations and the United States. And tribal nations are located within the geographic borders of the United States mostly, while each exercises its own sovereignty. Other things that support tribal sovereignty include the Snyder Act of 1921. So in this, the Congress, congressional approved budgets for US spending in total specifically include appropriate for the benefit, care, and assistance of Indians in the United States as part of budgeting for the purpose of health and other items for tribal nations and tribal citizens. So tribes receive some federal funding for programs operated by the tribe, including things like health programs. And federal funds often come from the non-defense discretionary portion of the US federal budget. Lots of fancy words, but it means that Congress has to approve of this budget, which includes funds for Indian Health Service and is in the annual appropriation bills that are passed. Right now, there are separate funds, such as funds set aside for Medicare and Medicaid, and some other health programs that are governed by existing laws put in place. And these, like Medicare and Medicaid, are considered mandatory spending of the US federal government and are separate from IHS funds. So IHS is part of the US Department of Health and Human Services and provides lots of different health services, such as, medical services of internal medicine, family practice, OBGYN, pediatrics, labs, scans, diabetes care, as well as dental services, optical services, therapy services, behavioral health services, pharmacy services, community health services, employee health services, telehealth services, and skilled nursing care facilities like Anna John. Any questions about the Snyder Act? Yes, Debbie?
I think it's important to note that even though the skilled nursing care services are listed up there, it took us 20-some years to fight Congress to be able to include the language to allow us to provide basic extended long-term care services in our funding agreements. However, in the Affordable Care Act, which was passed in 2006, long-term care, skilled nursing services was also language that was approved in that Affordable Care Act. However, Congress has never appropriated money to be able to cover the services of long-term care. So the nursing home services here are provided through tribal contribution and through third-party revenue. It is not a service that's covered under the Indian Health Service. So we can't use IHS funds to provide services here.
Yeah, so in case you didn't hear what was shared, it's important to note that IHS, while it can provide these basic health services, obviously we know from everyone across all tribes that they don't receive these basic services, and these are not necessarily approved through IHS for their tribe, their tribal people. And Congress, who approves the overall budget for IHS, often will not approve certain lines of budget to be provided, such as skilled nursing care services. Yeah, go ahead.
This one's for Debbie. Is there a process like to go through to get that changed to add long-term care?
It's up to Congress to appropriate the funds, and that's why our elected officials are there fighting continuously to try and not only include services such as long-term care, we list it as a priority for every time we go to negotiate our funding agreements. We list long-term care as a priority for our nation. But like was shared, IHS is never funded at 100%. Right now, our IHS funds cover about 42% of the level of need for the services that we provide. We're one of the lowest funded areas, which is Bemidji, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Illinois, and Ohio. We are one of the lowest funded of all of the areas throughout IHS. Prior to about 2006, we were funded at 34% of the level of need. So we've gone up, not a whole lot, but that's thanks to the, to the efforts of our elected officials that are there continuously fighting to increase our funds. So we've gotten up to 42%, but we're still not funded at the level of need that we need to have.
Yeah, as a recap and addition, it's really the government to government relationship and the United States government saying that we don't need to give 100% funding to IHS, and our government leaders who go to DC and talk to their congressional representatives to have that government to government relationship and say these things need to happen, right? And so IHS can provide some of these things, but obviously relying on separate funds like Medicare and Medicaid, which are available to U.S. citizens in general, really supplements a lot of things. And so creating the billing system so we can have the health services here bill not just to IHS set aside funds, but third-party payers and other things as well, enables the healthcare to actually be seen and realized. So I don't know if anyone else has other things to add on there. Another thing that relates to healthcare and tribal sovereignty is the Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. So, like was mentioned just a little bit ago, the Bemidji area of IHS supports our tribal health services here in Oneida through the public law of Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act. And what's important about this is that as part of the United States Department of Human and Health Services, the secretary for that department of the U.S. is prohibited from waiving, modifying, or diminishing in any way the trust responsibility of the United States with respect to Indian tribes and individual Indians that exist under treaties, executive orders, other laws, or court decisions. And this provides support for the tribe running health services here and funded from IHS as well as other things. So Oneida entered into the compact in 1997 with the Secretary of the U.S. Department of Human and Health Services to offer IHS-based services here in Oneida. You can find out more about IHS through the QR code on the screen right now. But from IHS, Oneida is assuming full funding and control over the programs, services, functions, or activities, or portions of those programs, services, functions, or activities that IHS would otherwise provide. And this also supports Oneida having sovereign control of the health programs, services, functions, or activities from IHS. And so our Oneida leadership here, both elected leaders and employees, are able to direct what those programs look like in response to community needs. So how do we determine what our community needs, right? So data really helps. And we as tribal people have been collecting data forever. Our wampum belts are a collection of data. And data are not a foreign concept to the indigenous world. Indigenous people have always been data creators, data users, and data stewards. Data were and are embedded in Indigenous instructional practices and cultural principles. That's a quote from Stephanie Russo-Carroll, who has defined what tribal data sovereignty looks like in current literature. And I really think of data as our relations, and it's part of our healing journey is to understand our own data and use that data to make decisions for our community. So what is tribal data? When you hear of the words tribal data, does anyone want to share what they think of?
Information specific to the tribe.
Information specific to the tribe. Yeah.
Gathering information to make better decisions.
Gathering information to make better decisions. Other things that come to mind when I say tribal data. Yeah?
I think for some it might be like having as a reporting mechanism to confirm like what you're doing to gain funding.
Tribal data is a reporting mechanism to gain funding and do what you want to do.
Gathering data to show a need.
Gathering data to show a need. Some tribal data I think of as budgets. Yeah?
To show a pattern.
Show a pattern of something. So data can be really useful. And when we think about tribal data, it's data, information, knowledge in any format that impacts Native people, tribal nations, or our communities at the collective and individual levels. So Oneida data is data about, me as a person. It's data about the land I live on. It's data about us as a group, right? What is Oneida's data on X? Is it Oneida's data on diabetes rates? Is it Oneida data on total spending? Those are various different types of tribal data. When we think about healthcare data, what comes to mind? Genetics. That's a big data set.
Probably like usability, like who actually uses the services at the healthcare center or the lab or the pharmacy.
Use rate of specific services related to healthcare.
Tracking for like A1Cs, things like that.
Tracking different lab levels for specific diseases. Other healthcare data that comes to mind. One of the things I usually think about when I think about this is not a common one. It's the number of years that you went to school. We use that in the healthcare setting for a lot of different determinants of health. Tribal healthcare data can be a bunch of different things, like genetic information, biological specimens that you provide when you have to go to the lab and give blood or urine or saliva or other specimens, as well as cognitive and social assessments, how well your brain is doing, how well you're interacting with others. Are you at risk of depression or failing in school? General health information such as what medications you're on, if you're taking any other supplements or traditional medicines, and how often you're exercising, how often you're reading, things like that. And other information like formal education years, how big your family is, how many siblings you have, how many children you have, and other medical data like your height, your weight, and blood pressure. So all of these things come up in healthcare stories as well. So another type of data that I think about is what is the experience of receiving healthcare? And some other things that come up as well in tribal healthcare settings is what is the traditional knowledge? Why are you taking a specific traditional medicine? What are you hoping it'll do for you? What is your relationship like to that medicine? And other big data sets, besides genetics, include demographics. So if you participated in the 2020 census, those demographics are really important as well in healthcare data. But why is tribal healthcare data important? So this is a cover from The Economist, and the title is "The World's Most Valuable Resource: Data and the New Rules of Competition." Can anybody tell me what they see when they look at this picture? Yeah.
Industry and progress.
Lots of industry. Kind of looks like an offshore mining rig, if you've ever seen one of those. Technology. Yeah? Data mining, yeah. So a lot of these big industrious companies are using advanced technology to mine data, right? Taking it out of somewhere and using it for some profit. So the question really becomes, we have all of this tribal healthcare data, but who is benefiting from this data, right? So it's really important to think of data as a reciprocal relationship to the tribe, because you have to be able to govern your own tribal healthcare data, but also use that data for governance. So what does that really mean? It gets this idea of indigenous or tribal data sovereignty. And you'll see like indigenous data sovereignty, tribal data sovereignty as terms in literature and in the national conversation that tribes are having about their healthcare data. I think we lost the mic. That tribes are having about their healthcare data or other types of data, right? In terms of business portfolios of different tribes, in terms of what tribes are using to make governance decisions about their environment, about their partnerships with companies. So all of that data is really important because tribal data sovereignty is a concept where it's the right of tribal nations to govern how that data is collected, their ownership of that data and what that looks like, and the application of their own data in different sectors. So are tech companies going to use data to make their own decisions, or is the tribe going to own that data and only allow the tech companies to use it for specific things? Thank you.
Thank you.
Can you hear me now? Okay, that's great. Thank you for fixing the mic. So yeah, so indigenous or tribal data sovereignty is the concept where tribes have the sovereign rights to govern how data is collected, what the ownership of that data looks like, and how that data is applied in different settings. So this, comes from tribes' traditional role in being responsible for community-held information and what that information looks like. And data is really important to have, and so there's data building, data rebuilding, being able to have that data. And that's really important way for the tribe to govern data, is having that data, controlling it, using it for what they need. But it's also important for the tribe because that data can be used to make governing decisions. So nation building and rebuilding is dependent on data, and data is dependent on the nation. And that reciprocal relationship around data is based in data sovereignty, or the right of the tribe to collect, own, apply, steward data. So knowledge in general belongs to the collective of the tribe and is fundamental to how we as a tribe operate, right? If we know that certain times a year, this is when we're going to pick apples from the orchard, that's the collective knowledge that we have about how our orchard is doing and our governing decisions about what is going to happen with the orchard. And tribal data governance is a way of implementing and actualizing what it means to have sovereign control over the data. So governing your data is an inherent part of the sovereign rights of tribes relating to data. And they're critical to exercise other types of sovereignty as well. So not just sovereignty of the data, but sovereignty of the healthcare system. One of the reasons that our leaders and our tribe have been able to get more funding from the Bemidji area IHS and from the United States government for tribal healthcare programs is because of the data that's collected from our clinic that supports the need for these programs. So having that data is critical to exercising the sovereignty of the community. Yeah.
I guess like a comment is like I see like data as a currency, and I never really thought about it too much until I think we were doing like an IRB meeting, and I think it was Myrna Warrington, and like she had established a nomination IRB, and she was talking about research, and I posed a question to her, is like, what's one thing that you would do different if you were to redo this whole process, and what was the biggest thing? And the biggest thing that she talked about was the monetary value of the data. And it really kind of resonated with me, because I think as Oneida, we're like, oh, we need to do things and be good neighbors. But if we're doing things to be good neighbors, are we leaving dollars on the table? Is if somebody gets our data and utilizes it. And that really struck me as I would have never thought of, what's the monetary value. It's like people come in and they want to study our language program, they want to do all these type of things, but then when it comes time to like get funding and do things, like she felt like they didn't really get like compensated for that monetarily. Can you comment on maybe that discussion?
Yeah, so, similar to drilling for oil, right, and extracting it from somewhere and making a profit off of it, taking data from a community and turning it into something that's a manufactured good of some sort, that can be a lot of different ways. Who here has known someone who's taken aspirin as a prescribed medication? So aspirin is a traditional medicine, and it comes from the bark of a tree, and this was known by indigenous people who have relationships with the tree, and they knew that if you chewed on this birch bark, it would alleviate some pain in your gums. And once this was figured out by scientists, they extracted the key component, which we now call aspirin, and turned it into a product. So that data from our traditional knowledges of relationships with different things can be extracted, turned into products, and be very profitable. Another example comes from the idea that, tanning processes that are traditional, that rely on the fats of the animal's brain and smoke and some other chemicals, those traditional tanning processes, those knowledges of how to do that and tanning those hides specific to our region here and what's the United States now, have been turned into huge commercial processes that a lot of successful companies have made really expensive leather off of, right? So the traditional knowledges that we have and other data is a lot of ways that has been mined and been made into profit. Another way is just the land that we exist on. So this is a photo of what tribal regions used to look like, and all of the overlapping colors are distinct, tribal ethnic groups that have existed. But this is kind of where tribes are now. So all of the dark areas are tribal reservations currently, and then there's large urban centers where a lot of tribal people live as well. So what we have to remember is that colonization has been going on for a really long time, and that includes the extraction of a lot of goods to turn into profit. Who here has seen this image before? A few people? So this is called American Progress, and it shows the land from east to west being turned into profit, being turned into railroad ways, being turned into electrified connections and farming land. And in the United States, the Norse first colonized the area of Newfoundland now. So that was the first colonization of what we call Turtle Island. And when the Silk Road was closed, Europeans who were used to traveling on that to seek specific spices in the Ottoman Empire wanted to travel west instead of east to find those spices and continue their profit off of the trade of those. Eventually, Jamestown succeeded in becoming a permanent colony here in the United States. And ever since then, European rulers have desired to own indigenous nature. So things like our minerals, our land, our forests, our water, our fish, other species, and make it into value. And now DNA, biospecimens from us, health data, what is our diabetes rate? Do they have a big smoking rate? Should I set up a tobacco shop here? All of those things have been mined as well. So who here has seen this image before? Yeah, it's a great image, and it's also called American Progress, but it was commissioned by the Indian Land Tenure Foundation, which is a native-led nonprofit, to show white buffalo women moving from west to east and bringing indigenous culture and lifeways back and cleaning a lot of the industrialization that's happened. So when we think about colonization, we usually think about it politically, right? It's a colony having exported raw materials to benefit some ruler somewhere else. But this can happen with our data as well. So the colonization of our data happens when raw data from us, from our community, from our tribe, is repurposed, processed, changed into manufactured goods. So the patent on aspirin was not held by the tribal people who knew where that drug came from, right? And this has happened a lot of times to various other tribal communities as well. So manufactured goods can look like a lot of things. It can look like books about who we are, what our traditional knowledges are. It can look like articles about rare genetic variants that exist in our community causing disease. And those can turn into things like intellectual property rights, patents, copyright law that can make real money off of in today's economy. Did that kind of answer your question about how our healthcare data can be turned into goods? So it's super important to consider because obviously our genetics look a little bit different since we've been living here much longer than some people who have European ancestors, right? And so everyone's genetics is very unique, and so that's a really good example of how that data can easily be leveraged to create a powerful new drug, to create new insights about treatments that we may know already work, and applying it to other people. So an example of what that really looks like includes something called the All of Us Research Program. Has anybody in here heard of the All of Us Research Program? So the All of Us Research Program is funded by the National Institutes of Health. The National Institutes of Health are also a part of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. And the National Institutes of Health funded this to create precision medicine for all Americans. And so a lot of people have been creating medical practices based on those willing to join studies about said medical practice. If we think about why do we measure blood pressure all the time? Well, there was a study that was done that showed blood pressure can predict your risk for certain diseases very, very well. And so now we measure blood pressure and get that data all the time to assess risk for cardiovascular disease, things like stroke, aneurysms, and heart arteries. So that data became really important to collect. However, right, the people who participated in that study were not from tribal communities. And so the All of Us Research Program, their goal is to make sure that everyone in America can participate in research studies. So a little quote about one of their flyers is, "Join us to learn how you can be included in shaping the future of healthcare for you. We think one day healthcare should be tailored to you. This is called precision medicine, and research can help get us there. How? By creating a resource that allows researchers to conduct thousands of studies on health and disease. Unfortunately, despite being called All of Us, this research study did not talk to any tribes before beginning its study. And as we mentioned before, Indian Health Service contracts out to tribes to conduct their own health programs and have their own clinics and run their own medical services. And All of Us relies on your electronic medical health records, of which Oneida keeps here for you as the patient and tribal member of Oneida. That record is under the control of the tribe. And so when All of Us went to a tribe and said, hey, we want to create a big data set that anyone can look at for any reason using your electronic medical records, this was a bit of a concern for tribal leaders who were wondering who was going to control this data, who was going to be the steward of this data, where was this data going to be owned, who was going to approve what's going to be done with the data, who's going to approve who's looking at the data. And so despite on their website, and you can go look this up independently, that All of Us will respect tribal sovereignty by working with tribal nations, the program so far has not meaningfully consulted with Oneida to date, and I don't know if Debbie wants to say more about that subject, but it's really important because this is a great example about how research studies relate to the tribal healthcare data sovereignty here in Oneida.
So I just wanted to comment a little bit. The reason why we felt this was important to get this information out to the community is because we were aware that there were contacts made with the tribe through one of the programs that the tribe operates through CIATS. Back in December, there was a flyer that just happened to come across, and it was from All of Us, and they were actually going into the CIATS office to recruit individuals to participate in this research study. Unfortunately, we were able to stop that presentation and to be able to stop them coming in because, as Lauren had shared, there was no true tribal consultation with anyone within the tribe. And that being a tribal program that's operated in CIATS, we felt it was important that we bring the information forward so that everybody in the community is aware of that, because there are certain areas where the All of Us researchers, although their concept of precision medicine is a good concept, the whole process of the research and protecting our specimens, protecting our data, protecting our genetics has to be really emphasized so that the community understands why it's important for us to be able to do that. So I just wanted to share that with you. And the reason that we're aware of the All of Us research is because I serve on the National Institute of Health for research as the Tribal Advisory Committee member from the member at large. And Dr. Lauren is my technical advisor. So we go to all of the areas, look at the research that's being done, look at what's happening and whether or not there was true tribal consultation. And so fortunately for the advisory committee, we were able to put a halt to some of the movement of the All of Us to going, and they were going out to various other tribes throughout the country and doing the same thing. Oh, we're just going to come and present, but they were actually recruiting individuals. And so we were able to stop, by the virtue of the Tribal Advisory Committee, to stop some of the research that was going on because they had not consulted with any of the tribes, but they were just going out to the urban areas and recruiting and bringing people in. And so we were able to get that message across. And it still is in limbo at this point, but we're still trying to get the word out to everybody. Any questions on that?
Yeah, what would be the guidance, I guess, with that, because that study is going on forward?
Well, the study is going forward, but what we're trying to emphasize is the significance of they have to consult with tribes. It's a federal requirement that in order for them to move forward and to continue with the funding through the National Institute of Health, they have to be able to consult with tribes. They have made efforts. They've included tribal members on some of their boards. They've gone out and tried to recruit tribal members into some of the larger city areas. But the significance that we want to stress is the fact that there has not been formal tribal consultation with tribal leadership. In order to have formal tribal consultation, they have to consult with elected officials, our elected leaders. They have to consult with them and get that permission to come into tribes and be able to make some of those decisions. Unfortunately, some tribes have just gone along with it and said, oh, this is a great idea, it's precision medicine, it's gonna help us. But when you look at all of the specifics of the research that's being done, it's really a question whether or not it's gonna be able to help.
Yeah, I mean, I don't work on the All of Us research program, but what I do know is their study design overall is that you give them all of your electronic medical records, and you can give them biospecimens as well, up to like 8 different types of biospecimens, hair, skin, everything. And then they collect all the information, and that's pretty much it. So there is no direct, benefit to you in participating in the study. And so there's also no direct benefit to the tribe to hand over data that, as we have talked about, can be really, really useful in creating new technologies, new treatments, things like that.
One of my concerns is when I attended the tribal self-governance, I enjoyed the concept and the presentation, but my question then became, well, who controls that data? And could we just, as a tribal nation, say, well, we want our data to do this, or do we need to get permission? And then he said, no, we would have to go up and get permission to do anything with access to our data as tribal members. And then the other question that I had to the gentleman presenting is okay, if that's true, then where is the tribal representation on that decision-making board? And I think that was coming up on probably about a year ago.
Yeah.
And there wasn't a surefire answer of saying, okay, your Oneida tribal liaison is your elected official, Jennifer Webster, and she's on our board and she can consult. There wasn't anything that he identified on that decision-making. So it really kind of concerned me as okay, here you go. Again, we're good neighbors. We give this to you. Then what? And the other part is, a lot of times they talk about, de-identifying. And I think in healthcare, when I hear always and never, I think that's not true. If somebody says they'll never be able to re-identify you,
Right.
but there's always technology, and people will say they'll never be able to access your data, and you hear about data breaches. And so that would be concerning to me, is if there's my biospecimens or genetic information, and then that gets out. So is that the next step with all of us, is forcing that representation as far as the decision making and the control part?
That's a great question. So I think that All of Us is making more time now that they've already been running the study for a few years. This started in 2019, which is also the same year that Oneida came up with the first code about research in Oneida. So you can also reference that code for the process of approving research. But since they've been doing it a few years, they have now made some concerted efforts to spend time with tribes, hire people who are tribal members to get their insight on the design team, as well as create entities that are advising them. But in terms of redoing their whole approval process, I have not heard anything on that front.
There hasn't been.
Yeah.
There hasn't been any progress on that front, but I think that the biggest thing that I can say from the National Advisory Committee is that we have really stressed the fact that we can't continue to approve unless you formally go through the process for tribal consultation. You can't go to a national meeting where there are tribal leaders and say, oh yeah, like the self-governance conference, oh yeah, there were tribal leaders there, we consulted, we did tribal consultation, because that's what they're counting. That's what their researchers are counting as consultation. And we're saying, from the advisory committee, saying that's not consultation. You have to formally go in and look at what do you have to do to formally consult with tribes in each of the areas. Because you can't just go to one national meeting and say, oh yeah, we did tribal consultation because there was 5 tribes there that were represented with their elected leaders. But they didn't ask to meet with any of the 5 tribes separately. So that's kind of where we're at right now, but we continue to stress the fact that consultation is significant in this case, and the ownership of the data, the ownership of what they're collecting. And that's one of the reasons why we've made tremendous efforts from the nation to try and really talk about research, talk about data sovereignty, talk about the significance and the importance of how research gets conducted here in Oneida, and who has control over all of that. You know, because we may not be here for the next 100 years, but what's going to happen to the data and the biospecimens that are collected now, 100 years from now? Who's going to have access to all of those data banks? Many of the tribes have moved forward and are very sophisticated in their research codes. We're behind the 8 ball. We haven't done that. And so you have Navajo, who has their own research code. They have their own IRB. Menominee has their own IRB. Oneida doesn't have anything yet. So we need to be really cautious about how we move forward. Do you have anything else?
Yeah, institutional review boards are super great mechanisms that were originally created to protect universities doing research from being sued by participants in said research. However, in 1996, Navajo was the first to create their own institutional review board, where they have a formal process to review research with people who are trained in how to review research and go through multiple layers of approvals through their governance system that allows them to make decisions for their tribe about what research they want to participate in, and the knowledge of what could be potentially harmful or how the data could be used, as well as legal agreements of their ownership of the data and where the data will be stored and who has access to the data, and the secondary approval process for data being accessed again. And it's never too late, because in Alaska, in the early first half of the 20th century, the CDC actually collected a lot of biospecimens from Alaska natives. And now there is a consortium of tribes that have actual physical and legal control over all of those biospecimens. So it did take some time to get those processes in place for actualizing data sovereignty for the tribes, but it's never too late.
Yeah. Go ahead, Florence.
Yeah, I've often wondered, you know, when you're going to do a research project on the tribe, the chair and whoever signs up on that resolution says right on the bottom there, the tribe is the owner of the collected data. So do we have a place to store all this data?
No.
Because, I mean, we need to protect our people, our community besides, so.
That's exactly the point. That's exactly the point. That's why we need to be able to gain the support and stress the importance of creating our own IRB, creating our laws that are going to protect our data sovereignty, that are going to protect all of the research that gets done, and that it benefits us, that it's not used against us.
Yeah, and that's, you know, the difference between having legal stewardship of data and physical stewardship, right? So physically is the data here? No, but legally, is it owned by the tribe?
Right.
Yes. So that's another part of data sovereignty that's really important to consider. So it's the right for Oneida to control how that data is saved, including things like healthcare data. And tribal healthcare is based in the federal trust responsibilities of tribes. So numerous treaties, congressional acts, Supreme Court rulings, presidential orders, other laws and statutes have existed that support Oneida and other tribes having control over their healthcare and governing the direction of that. Similarly, data and controlling how that data is collected, who owns it, how it's applied, how is it stored, what happens to it, all those things is a sovereign right of the tribe. Other questions?
Sid has a question.
I'm gonna just kind of do like a plug here, I guess. I feel like as a nation, we're always willing to look at outside resources. Oh, we need to bring a consultant in for this, but we've had higher education for probably like 30 plus years. Can you comment about like the level of content experts that we have with our own community that would make up this IRB, like it would protect our data? Is that a resource that we have for the Oneida Nation, or is it something that we need to go outside of the Oneida Nation? And then can you comment on like IRB or reviews? Should this fall on like one person, or should this fall on a group of people? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. White. So I think when it comes to the question of where does Oneida stand at being able to have competent people from our own tribe, educated in our own ways and our own experiences as Oneida people, we do have quite a few individuals who have gone on to get their PhDs, MDs, JDs, various other doctorates, as well as those in master's programs, trained health professionals, trained researchers, and many of us have experience going through an institutional review process, as well as receive training on how to sit on an institutional review board. So there are different certificate programs and training programs that a lot of us have gone through, myself included. I'm certified to be an IRB member through the city program right now. And so what that looks like is specific training of how to look at research that's being proposed, and specific parts of those proposals to consider the legal impacts of, as well as the ethical impacts of. So one reason that tribes have created their own IRBs is because tribes consider things at the collective level. What is the collective impact on the tribe of this research? Those things aren't considered by other IRBs. So I work at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and through trial and error, the university has gotten a lot better about thinking, what is the collective impact on the tribe? But it's not their first instinct, right? And myself and others as tribal members with training have thought, what is the collective impact of this research on the tribe? So it does take people with varied expertise to be able to look at a variety of different research proposals and specific training on how to conduct an institutional review board, to be able to have that reassurance that the research is being approved correctly and for the correct reasons. So this is the other reason that tribes are able to legally have institutional review boards under U.S. federal code and have those boards registered so that when anyone looks up who is the correct entity to get my research approved for, tribal IRBs are listed there because they are their own sovereign entities that have their own rules and regulations that have to be followed legally. And if they're not, then researchers who don't follow those legal codes on the books can be taken to court, right? And it's also important that these legal agreements are held up if future profits are seen from the research as well.
Go ahead.
Yeah, one area where is the largest database of all of our DNA is with blood heel spot and the infant blood spots that are taken from heel sticks, and that's stored at the state lab of hygiene. A number of years ago, it was discussed, it came up to mine, I guess I'll use that word, to take those blood spots because somebody wanted to do something with it beyond the looking at genetic conditions, PKU, for example, and others. And so at that time of that discussion, I do not recall that anyone made conversation, I guess, of the tribes being in a conversation about that data or mining it or getting it or whatever.
I can tell you that they were attempted back 20, 30 years ago. We actually had participation from the Oneida Nation on one of the state boards that looked actually at the accuracy of birth and death certificates for infants for tribal members. And the inaccuracy that was evident at that time, if there was a native baby who was born, say at St. Vincent's, and the last name was Hernandez, they were listed as Latino. They were not listed as Oneida. And so we noticed that that data was so inaccurate, because if somebody just looked at you when you went into labor and delivery to have that baby, they would make an assumption of what you looked like based on what the ethnicity of that baby would be. And so there was a lot of legwork that was done at the state level to try and address the inaccuracies, and we made some progress, but there still is a lot of work to be done on some of that level. I mean, we still see it even now when you get ER reports that come in from the hospitals. You get ER reports and they'll say Hispanic young male or Hispanic young female because their name happens to be Corona. You know, they're Oneida, but their last name's Corona. And so, you know, there's a lot of inaccuracies that we see in a lot of that.
Yeah, I think it's really important to continue the conversation and think about what data is being collected and how the tribe is owning it, not just to govern the data itself, right, but to use that data for governance. And so, you know, when we think about at our own local level what that looks like with local healthcare agencies, state healthcare agencies, we also have to think about the national level, because that's where a lot of legwork gets done as a collective for all tribal nations. So it's really important that we support, you know, our tribal leaders speaking to the federal government about these important things, so that the federal government can make decisions that will benefit things like state, you know, reaffirming tribal identities and providing that data to the tribe on death certificates. One thing that is a really great quote from Abigail Echohawk, who is Pawnee based in Seattle, is, you know, we live native, but then we die white. Every death certificate usually shows up white listed on there. Not American Indian, not Alaska Native, not certainly the tribal entity. And those death certificates and this demographic data that we talked about a little bit earlier is really important for funding for tribes, and it's that national level demographics that people look at to make decisions about, well, IHS actually doesn't need that much money, right? Tribes actually don't need these health services because there's not that many people that are native. So these are really important discussions to have about data. Any final questions, thoughts? Yeah?
So you mentioned the tribes here in Wisconsin that have their own IRBs and how beneficial that is for them. Can you talk a little bit about what our process looks like now for for kind of if there's somebody that wants to do a project or something, and what that process looks like here in Oneida and how sustainable that is?
It's not sustainable. In 2019, there was a resolution that was created and passed by the business committee. And that resolution said that basically any health-related research goes to the comprehensive health division director. One person, me. I have to review that research. That's anything to do with human subjects, that's anything to do with health relation. I have to review all of those and then make my recommendation to the business committee with a resolution giving them guidance in terms of what they need to do. That on top of everything else that we have to do. Anything that's not health related goes to the chief counsel. Chief counsel has to review that. So if it's environmental, if it's land, if it's anything other than health, chief counsel has to review that, and then she makes her recommendations to the business committee. That's two people. And to look at everything that has to be taken into consideration when you're looking at data, when you're looking at the rights of the human subjects when you're looking at, are they going to be protected? Who's going to have access to all of this information? Where is it going to be stored? Is it going to be published? Are we going to be listed in the publications? Do we have the ability to review those publications beforehand? I mean, we can put that all in the resolution, but there's no way we can go back and actually say, well, we're not going to continue to approve your research because you didn't do this, this, and this. We don't have the time to be able to do that. So there's 2 people right now for the nation that reviews any research.
Yeah, conversely, there's other tribes besides Ho-Chunk has their own IRB, and so does Menominee, that are building their IRBs as well, and they're doing it from the talented individuals, you know, that grew up in their communities and have advanced degrees and experience with institutional review boards. And those individuals have, you know, a 21-person board where 7 of them meet, you know, monthly, and they're building out those processes right now to have a more sustainable review process and continuing review too, which is what academic institutions do. So every year, people who are conducting the research that's been approved have to go back and give an update on this is what's happened. Has anything bad happened? Has anything unexpectedly good happened? How is the community responding to the research? And right now we don't have any of that process. So, other questions?
What about collaboration, like with some of the other tribal nations, since they've done some work? Like, is that a possibility as far as you're not starting?
It's
scratch?
definitely a possibility. In fact, when we first started the research work that we were trying to do to develop an IRB, we used a lot of the other tribes' laws to look at how we could move this forward. And in fact, Lauren presented to the LOC when she was still a student back in
21.
Yeah.
21.
So it's been a long, drawn-out effort. We're kind of at a standstill right now, but you know, we've been called rogues because we're going outside of the norm in trying to push this forward. But I mean, you can see the significance of what the implications of not having something in place could be to the nation. And that's our goal, is how do we protect the nation and the citizens of the nation, because it's your data. You know, 20 years from now, we don't know what'll happen. You know, we don't know with technology who might have access to anything, but if we have laws in place that can protect that, that's what we need to do.
Other questions? Yeah.
All right, so recently I read about 23andMe filing for bankruptcy,
Mm-hmm.
and there appears to be like a rush to delete the data.
Yes.
This business already had a data breach of 7 million people's DNA in 2023.
Mm-hmm.
How would I ensure my information is protected?
Yes, so 23andMe did file bankruptcy, and so all of the data that has been put into their giant genomic database is up for sale. And there is a very step-by-step process article online that I can share if you email me or reach out. That article details how you can go into your 23andMe portal and delete your data permanently so that that data is not sold to another entity. And that genomic data has a lot of information in it. Mm-hmm. It has your eye color, your blood type, and you also in 23andMe often fill out your demographics report, so how tall you are, how much you weigh, all of those things are very similar to the data set that all of us is building as well. So all of that health data can be used to predict many, many things. All right. Well, we do have a meeting survey for you all to fill out. We would really appreciate it if you would scan the QR code and provide feedback about this community discussion.
Go ahead.
You said you were considered a rogue? And some of us in the community, we attended another meeting where Menominee explained their IRB.
Mm-hmm.
And so, is it my understanding that there are some
some that think we already have it. One, because you do it and the law office does it, but how do we get past that to inform people that we need more than that? Because it's just you two doing it. And a person may think, well, we have one because you do it. But that's we need to do more. So I guess how do we get leadership to recognize that we need more?
Yeah, so Debbie, do you have any formal IRB member training?
Yes, I do. I've actually sat on the ethics committee and the IRB at St. Mary's Hospital in St. Vincent's a number of years prior to, in another life before. But, you know, that's the basis of the significance of why we need to move this forward, because you can't just create a committee and say, you're gonna review all of these research proposals now without any formal training. You have to have the formal training to understand the significance of what that all means, what you're protecting, what you're trying to put into place to assure that all of those steps are in place, and to also have some kind of a tracking mechanism to make sure that if that article, if that paper, if that research gets published and we're formally listed, we have to have the ability to say, you can't publish that because you have to come and get our approval first.
Yeah, so I think all of your advocacy of, understanding what data is, what the sovereignty of the tribe to self-govern what's done with data, and what that looks like, I think is really important in the community to talk about how what we have right now is something, but is it a sustainable model that will allow the tribe to control its data moving forward? Not really.
One part of that Alzheimer's, that board, and that's what the University of Wisconsin is working right now with you, is that process. But you don't have the regular IRB board, so they have to go through you, Debbie, and Sid, and the law office. So they really want to work with the United Nations.
And actually, when that project first started, that's how that resolution got created in 2019, because there was so much confusion when they came in that some people were going over here, some people were going over here, and when the resolution was actually passed, all of a sudden I got paperwork and they said, well, you have to review this. I'm like, who said I have to review it? Nobody told me I had to review it. Well, your name's right here in the resolution. That's the first I'd seen the resolution. So, that process is a little bit better. It's a little bit smoother now. But again, when you get 5 or 6 requests in a month and you've got everything else to do besides your regular work, it's impossible to try and look at all of that information because there isn't time in the day to be able to do it.
Well, yeah, usually there's also, in addition to the people who serve on the board and discuss each proposal, there's usually an administrator who makes sure that every piece of information the board is looking for is collected from the research project. And kind of how you mentioned, myself included, there's a lot of Oneida trainees out there that want to do research to create data that's useful to the tribe while they're in school, while they're doing a job that's related to the tribe. There's a lot of people, our own members, who want to make data that's useful to tribal leaders to make governing decisions. But there is a very bottlenecked approval process in place right now.
So speak to your legislators. Speak to your elected officials. I've done presentations with the general manager. I've also done a presentation with a couple of the elected officials, but that's where it has to be. We have to be able to move it forward into the LOC and to get it into law so it can be moved forward. And we need to have the support.
Yeah, and I would say that, there are some people who think, well, we have Debbie here. Why do we need an institutional review board? And I think that, unfortunately, Debbie will have to retire at some point. My saddest time is going to be when she retires. But, you know, without Debbie's superpowers of being able to review everything, we will need a more sustainable system in place so that the review happens and it happens to a level where the tribe is legally protecting its data.
So with that, oh, you have a question?
Oh, no, I was just gonna comment, I was gonna say, well, thankfully we have our tribal leader, Jenny, and thankfully she's interested enough to come,
Mhm.
and, you know, and hopefully she can empower the other folks on the business committee as well to promote the advocacy. I think that's great, so we're so glad you're here, Jenny.
Thank you. So with that, make sure you fill out our survey, make your comments so that we can share that information. And thank you, Sid, for all of the coordination and all the work that Sid does behind the scenes, making sure this happens. So if you do have information, our contact information is on the slide. And does anybody else have any other questions? I just wanted to touch base real quickly, just to give you all an update on, I know there's been a lot of activity at the federal level with a lot of things happening with the presidential executive orders, and I just wanted to reassure everybody that at this point, Oneida Comprehensive Health Division is not impacted by any of those executive orders at this point. We don't know what will happen if there's Medicaid cuts, which could severely impact us if that were to happen. But at this point, the support of Dr. Oz to be the lead of the Center for Medicaid Services, it's gone through the first level, now it's at the Senate level, but it has not been confirmed as of yet. But many of the national entities with our elected officials have been at the table saying, you know, and stressing the importance of sovereignty, expressing the importance of we are, as Oneida, not a minority group. We are a government, and that's the information that we've continued to stress at the local level, at the state level, and at the national level. And thank you, Jenny, for all the trips you've made. Thank you to Hassie for all the trips he's made. And I know that Melinda was out there because I've been getting texts this week from Melinda. She's in DC this week for the self-governance. And so, you know, we're trying to be at every table we can to stress the importance of looking at tribes and protecting that trust responsibility that we talked about tonight. Because without doing that, we have to be at the table, our voices have to be heard so that we can be protected as nations versus being impacted by executive orders.
Mm-hmm. And this also happens at the state and local level as well. So if you haven't seen the State of the Tribes that happened last week, it also talked about sovereignty, and tribe sovereignty in so many things, including healthcare, is really important to stress at our state and our local level as well. So if you are ready to vote on April 1st, highly encourage you to vote. And now you can talk to your current and future business committee members about data sovereignty as well.
Go ahead.
You know, in the past, there was always a process to get approval up to the VC, and one of those links was the law office. So aren't they, or could they be part of this IRB?
They could be. They are part of the process right now. The chief counsel is the other person that reviews the other research that's non-health related. So again, she's one person and I'm one person. So we need more. We need more people to be able to do that. That's what an IRB would be able to do, is to take that load off of just two people and spread the wealth so that we can make more sound decisions on some of that research that comes forward.
Is that the definition of a board? It's
Yes,
several people.
thank you. Make sure you help yourselves. There's lots of pizza over here, lots of cupcakes. Thank you all for coming tonight, and we appreciate your feedback and all of your input. And please make sure you complete the survey for us. And thank you, Lauren.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you.